Welcome, everyone, to the introduction of Genesis, the beginning of God's Word. Genesis 1 1 to 3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Beautiful verses that we will get into at the beginning of the study. But for now, we'll leave that as it is. So I'm going to be taking off my camera for the introduction videos, only because when I did the general introduction to the Bible, my camera got in the way of certain words, and I didn't like that, and I don't think you guys liked it either. So I'm going to turn off my camera for these. But then when we do the Bible study, I will have my camera, so you'll see me. You'll see my facial reactions. It'll be fun. All right. Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, I almost completely removed the thing from the. Okay, anyway. So what is the title of the book? I know it sounds like a weird question, but this is just interesting, something to talk about. Watch. According to Jewish tradition, the title of the book was the first word of the book, which would be Bereshit, which means in the beginning. See it right here, Bereshit. There's the whole verse 1. The modern title comes from the Latin Vulgate, where they took from the Greek term geneseos, which in this context would mean origin. So if you look up the word on Strong's, you'll get different definitions. But generally, like in this context, origin is the best one because you got a lot of origin in this book: origin of man, origin of sin, origin of creation, origin of Israel, etc., etc., etc. A lot of that. Origin of the promise of Jesus, which is in Genesis 3, which we'll talk about that when we get there. So that is the title of the book. I prefer just to call it Genesis because if I say Bereshit, I doubt anyone's gonna understand. I don't know if they call it Bereshit today for Jews. I'm not sure. I'll have to look that up. But if they do, I wouldn't mind saying Bereshit just for them. But when I'm talking to Christians or people that know it as Genesis, I'll just use Genesis just to keep it simple. Just that's what we've traditionally called it. No reason to change it. Don't fix what's not broken. Anyway, who wrote Genesis? The two main views and their evidence. So the first view, then these are general. There's different forms of each view, but the first view is the traditional view is that Moses wrote it, with possibly some people previously compiling parts, such as Abraham. There's a note on the bottom also that's relevant. It's possible there were some later contributions, but this isn't the same as the documentary hypothesis, which we'll talk about in a second. And Moses is the general writer. So, although there may be some earlier and later portions, Moses is the general writer and possibly the one who compiled it. If earlier people wrote it, excuse me. So, the author would be Moses. This is my view, by the way. I believe Moses wrote it. The more liberal view among atheist scholars or etc. They believe what's called the documentary hypothesis, and there are different forms. There's also different views that are not necessarily the documentary hypothesis per se, but anyways, different views that say it's not Moses. This is the main one, the documentary hypothesis. Later Jewish scribes, probably during the Jewish exile, this is a bit of a this is partially true, but they will concede that the earliest is probably the 10th century, the 900s is when it started. And we'll look at the next slide. I have a summary of it. So there are often two accounts of the same event, or two names. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. What am I doing? So that's a documentary hypothesis that later Jewish scribes from as early as the 10th century, going as late as the 6th century, contributed to different portions, and that eventually made up what we now call Genesis. So, what is the evidence for Moses writing it? First of all, the Bible repeatedly identifies the law of Moses, which would include Genesis, Luke 24:44, which we'll open it up really quick. Whoops. Okay, there we go. All right. Luke, Luke, apologies. All right. And it says, "Then he said to them, These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all the things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me." So the law of Moses was understood to be the entire Torah, which would include Genesis, which would mean that this is from Moses, Genesis. Now let's go back to the presentation. Excuse me for the background noise. The Bible identifies the author directly as Moses, John 7:22 and Acts 15:1. So this is going to be directly for Genesis. Let's open up these texts really quick. John 7:22. Anyway, so here's John 7:22. Moses therefore gave you circumcision, not that it was from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. So look what it says. Moses gave you circumcision, but it was not from Moses, from the fathers, Abraham, in Genesis 17. So how is it that Moses gave circumcision, but it wasn't from him? Well, the answer is that he's the one who wrote Genesis. What about Acts 15:1? And certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved, which is not true, by the way. So the custom of Moses, this is what they understood it, a custom of Moses, yet Abraham was the one who instituted it. Well, technically God, but it started with Abraham. So how can this be the custom of Moses if it started with Abraham? Because they understood that Moses wrote Genesis. So we see biblical evidence that yes, it identifies the author as Moses, not within Genesis itself, but in the rest of the Bible, you would include Moses as the author. So Genesis itself does not mention the author, but externally the Bible mentions it. But what about extra biblical evidence? So first of all, Moses received a good Egyptian occasion. Occasion? I don't know what I just said. Let me try that again. Moses received an Egyptian education. Acts 7:22. And just in case you reject the book of Acts and say, look, that's centuries later, so you can't use that as a source for Moses. Well, this is reasoning they had based on what the text of Exodus says. So, Acts 7:22, and Moses learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and it was mighty in words and deeds. Moses was taught from the Egyptians. He received a really good education. Why? Because Pharaoh's daughter raised him. She found him and raised him. So, yes, Moses had a really good background and was qualified to write not only the book of Genesis, but the entire Torah. This really helps for Genesis because he obviously didn't live through all those events, but he must have had some he must have had some way to be able to, all right, I can gather information. All right, this is this goes here. He had that capability. That's why you'll see in movies like Prince of Egypt, him being portrayed as like an actual prince in Egypt, because he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. The last piece of evidence is the Torah identifies itself, Moses writing things down. Let's go to Exodus 17:14. I gotta finish this fast. I mean, it's such I'm in like a weird position for my back, and my throat is giving out on me. So let's see if I can make this quick. Then Yahweh, I'm gonna say so. Just a quick note going forward. Whenever you see Lord in all capitals, that's the divine name, the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh. I'm gonna be saying Yahweh instead of the Lord. Just a thing I personally do. So whenever you see this, just know I'm pronouncing it as Yahweh because that's what it is in the Hebrew. So then Yahweh said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under the heaven. So the Torah itself identifies Moses as writing things down. So this could easily include Genesis. If he was writing things down, he very well could have been writing Genesis with oral traditions. We'll get into that, how he wrote it at the end. But I believe it is easily him that was the one writing it. What about the evidence for the documentary hypothesis? The first piece of evidence is that there are often two accounts of the same event or two names. So, for example, there are two creation accounts, and one uses the term Elohim, whereas the other one uses the term Yahweh. Look at Genesis 1 through 2:3, and then versus Genesis 2:4 through 24. Let's actually look at one verse each, just to sort of see what they mean. I'm not going to look at the whole thing now. We will look at that in the future when we go through the creation accounts, which will pretty much be like the start of the series. Hopefully, it won't take that long. So here's Genesis 1:3, the first one, supposedly the first creation account. Then Jesus said, "Let Jesus." Oh my goodness. Then God. Well, Jesus is God, but anyway. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And this is the history of the heavens and of the earth when they were created in the day that Yahweh God made the heaven, the earth, and the heavens. So you see the difference in name. There's Yahweh. Well, Yahweh God. It has both. So that kind of brings evidence against this evidence. But you have Elohim here, and then you have Yahweh here, and then this it starts again by saying this is the history of the heavens after already the first part already mentioned the history of the heavens. So they'll say, well, that's two different accounts. That's two different creation accounts. They'll say that were contributed by other authors. The genealogies in Genesis begin with this is the book. This is the book of generations, meaning it is likely different texts put together. Then there's a third piece of evidence: knowledge of the events after Moses' death, like the kings of Israel in Genesis 36:31. So just to point, hold on, yeah, put that there. Just to point that out, the book of, so for example, if you go through the generations of Esau, it will say this is the book of generations. So that's the argument, and we'll get into that in a second because I have responses, general responses. Anyway, Genesis 36:31. Now these were the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the children of Israel. So the author seems to have knowledge of the kings of Israel, and we will probably get into that when we get to Genesis 36:31. And then finally, the repetitions within the text indicate that there were different editions from different scribes. And you can see that kind of sounds like a stretch, but that's the best I can put the argument because it was a weak argument. And here we have contra the documentary hypothesis. Excuse me. This is the documentary hypothesis right here, the summary. There's you see the Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomic tradition, priestly work, giving us the GEDP sources. So that's it right there. That's a summary. So here's in response to saying there are two accounts of different things, I would argue the two accounts are often either two different stories, so they're not the same event, they're different events. There might be similarities, but they're not the same event. Or there might be other misunderstandings that are involved in the text. So, for example, maybe sometimes they are harmonized, maybe they're harmonizable, and there's just a misunderstanding. Or there could be other things that are going on, depending on the text. We'll look at it more in depth as we go through. Because remember, these are my general responses. Number two, then two names do not prove multiple contributions. I can write the following, and this is a kind of a weird example, but anyways, I went to the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of America was beautiful. There's another example where you would say, Joe Biden just got inaugurated into office. I hope the president does well. You're using two different titles there. Not that you're having two different scribes contribute, but you're writing the same thing or saying the same thing. It's from you. So two names don't indicate, well, this must be two different scribes from different centuries, or that people are differently, or even not even different centuries. Doesn't indicate that two different people are writing it. It just means that he's using different names. The books or documents of genealogy are easily explained as either sources Moses had and incorporated into Genesis, or simply how we title the genealogy sections, because the Hebrew word for book also means document. So each genealogy is considered a document that you could use as genealogies. Either one works. I think it's a stretch to say that this is the result of saying this is the book of genealogies. Obviously, they use it as a cumulative case, so it's not. This is like each portion is not individual evidence. It's all together one cumulative case. But either way, my response stands. These are two much more likely explanations than scribes contributed to it centuries later. The supposed knowledge of events after Moses are misunderstandings, or maybe they were later scribal additions, I forgot to write this, that weren't necessarily this. All right. So it's possible that during the time of kings that they did add before there was kings in Israel in Genesis 36:31. I don't think that's the case in that specific text, but there may be some times where things like that happen. When we get to Genesis 14:14, I have to look deeper into it, but supposedly that's a later addition. But anyways, I digress. The repetitions are likely used for emphasis. So the repetitions, I don't understand that argument, honestly. Repetitions of words don't indicate it must be different scribes. We don't do this with any other text. The repetitions are easily explained as emphasis. They're repeating the same thing to emphasize it. I'm reading currently James White's book, Dr. James White, The Forgotten Trinity, and he tends to repeat things a lot to really emphasize his point. It's not that, okay, this must be this must be different people writing the book. No, it was written by Dr. James White, but that's just how he presented it. He emphasized things by repeating them. Not that different scribes contributed to his book. No. Although I guess you can say some people contributed in a way, but not in the sense like this. All right. So, next. When was Genesis written? According to the documentary hypothesis, which I reject, the earliest contributions were as early as the 10th century BC, 900s. And you saw the chart before. And the latest around the 6th century, 500, specifically 586, when they were captured by Babylon, exiled. This eventually, say maybe 5th century or the 400s, led to what we now call Genesis. Because we have manuscripts of Genesis from the 3rd century, I believe, 4th or 3rd century. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but we have manuscripts from those times. So it's safe to say that under this hypothesis, it would be more the 400s or the 5th century. All right. However, contrary to the documentary hypothesis, Moses being the author would place it sometime in the 15th century, 1400s, when he was likely alive. So this one says we didn't get the full book of Genesis until sometime in probably the 400s, say maybe 450. That's under that documentary hypothesis when we get Genesis as it is today, although contributions came way earlier. Under Moses being the author, it would be written sometime in the 1400s when he was alive and active. And it was probably after the Exodus, which is in Exodus 12:31 to 42, which was roughly 1445 BC. As I don't see Moses writing about it during his years in Egypt or contending with Pharaoh, I would say maybe 1445 to 1440 BC is when it was likely written. That's just my guess. I could be wrong. So, if Moses was around in the 1400s or the 15th century, which that's the estimate of the conservative scholars, 1400s, and I believe liberal scholars say the same thing, 1400. So that's the estimate. I don't think it's that far off. So under this hypothesis, I would say that he's not writing it before the Exodus. Why? Because number one, when he was being raised, I don't think he was particularly worried about recounting the history of his people. I don't think so. I think he was more getting raised up in the Egyptian way. I don't know if he discovered he was a Hebrew later or if he knew already he was a Hebrew. I'm not sure. But either way, by the way, this is Abraham right here. Anyway. So I don't know. I don't know for sure for that. But I don't think it's likely that he was writing it before then. And during when he was contending with Pharaoh, I don't think he was particularly worried about recounting the history of the Israelite people then either, because, well, he was busy trying to free them. Then afterward, when it starts mentioning he wrote things down, like in Exodus 17, 14, I think that, yes, then it is possible that he started writing things down about Genesis. So that would be around 1445 to 1440 BC. Now we're going to do an overview of Genesis, and we're going to close it right here. So I do think Moses probably got. Oh, excuse me, I wrote this wrong here, but I think Moses probably had written sources, oral tradition, and revelation from God to write Genesis. So he spoke to God, obviously, throughout Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He spoke to God repeatedly, and I think that he did have written sources that he was able to have. I think there's a book actually mentioned that we don't have today in Exodus, if I'm not mistaken. I'll put it on the screen if I can find the verse. But yeah, I think it's likely he had written sources with him to be able to use that he researched. There's also oral tradition. I think it's very possible that Jews were preserving oral tradition of what happened down from Adam all the way down. And then revelation from God is obviously he spoke to God. There are some minor parallels with other ancient works, not because they were copied, but because they likely had similar traditions and sources. And Genesis is likely a polemic against these texts. So think about like the Epic of Gilgamesh. I don't think that Genesis is directly copying it, but I do think that they had similar sources that they were using and that they had maybe similar traditions. Obviously different because they're different people, but anyway. I do want to read this section from the introduction of Genesis in the Apologetic Study Bible. This is it's highlighted Genesis and ancient myths. And I'll take a picture and put it on the screen, but for now I'm just going to read it here. The parallels between chapters 1 through 11, and creation and flood myths have elicited the question: is the Bible merely a Hebrew version of myths about beginnings? When weighing the importance of parallels, these principles should be kept in mind. First, not all parallels are equally significant, since minor ones can be attributed to common content. Second, the identity of who is borrowing from whom cannot be definitively concluded. Often it is best to assume a universal memory as the source, excuse me. That's the end of a sentence. Third, the function of the stories are much different. For example, the flood story of the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic is incidentally to the main idea of telling how Gilgamesh sought immortality. In the Bible, by contrast, the flood narrative is central to the development of this theme. That the Bible's theology is divergent from the polytheism of antiquity argues against the Bible's dependence on sources from other cultures. The author of Genesis was aware of the cultural context of the nations and often crafted his accounts to counter the prevailing view. The historical framework of chapters 1 through 11, example, these are the generations of Genesis 2, 4, and 5, 1, and the genealogies, chapters 4 through 5, and then chapters 10 through 11, indicate that the author presented a historical account, not a literary myth. So you see sort of the point that's being made that it's that first of all, there's minor parallels, sure. There's no significant parallels. When Westhoff debated Billy Carson, I don't think Billy Carson was able to present a major parallel between Genesis or say the Epic of Gilgamesh. His parallels are minor, like dividing waters from the waters, which is pretty much in like every work. The second point there that they have is you cannot identify who's borrowing from whom. It cannot be definitively concluded. So it's best to say they have universal sources, universal memory, universal traditions. Maybe not necessarily universal, but they have similar traditions or memory or sources. The third point they have is that the functions of the story are much different. You compare Gilgamesh in the flood story that happened for his immortality, where in the Bible it's not only it says development of the theme, not only that, but it was also judgment of God. By the way, you see here this is a beautiful picture right here of Noah's Ark, really beautiful. Anyway, and then the last 2 points here, they have that first of all, the Bible is monotheistic, so they wouldn't directly be relying or stealing from polytheistic books, and that you have historical framework where it says the genealogies and these are the generations of stuff like that is presenting an historical account. So I do think that Genesis was at least chapters 1 through 11 were written for polemics is like, for example, uh there's Islamic polemics where you go against Islam. So polemic would be like going against certain beliefs. So I do think Genesis 1 through 11 are definitely a polemic against, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's not directly trying to copy them. They probably had similar sources, yes, but not trying to copy it. It's trying to combat it. So this is the beginning. This is the beginning of many things in the Bible and the foundation to look back to as we progress in the series. So we got the beginning of man, the beginning of creation, the beginning of anything. Even within the text, you've got a lot of firsts, like the first murder, the first what? Oh, first polygamy, first instance of polygamy. You get this kind of stuff. A lot of firsts. That's why it's Genesis, origin, Geneseos. Now, I want you guys to read this. Pay attention to how God works in Genesis and who he works with. God works in strange ways to us and works with sinners. So I really want you guys to pay attention to this as we go through the series. Notice the way God works, how he does what he does. And I also want you to notice the people he works with. A lot of people, like Muslims, will say that the people that God worked with, the prophets, were great, amazing people. Not always the case. So, for example, I mean, you can say, yes, Daniel was an upright man, sure, but he wasn't perfect. He himself acknowledged that he sinned. Now, when you look to people in Genesis, there are no Daniel. I'm telling you, there are no Daniel. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, they were no David. I mean, excuse me, they were no Daniel. So God's people that he worked with are not perfect. They're flawed. They're sinners like us. Another thing to notice is how God will work. We're going to see God's sovereignty in suffering, which we'll especially see in Job, but also in Genesis. We'll see God making covenants. We're going to talk a little bit about covenant theology, probably. I gotta find in the Reformation Study Bible, they have an article on it, so I'll probably read it out just to explain it. We see how God works. It's going to be interesting. Then you have the Trinity is in Genesis. We're also going to talk about young Earth creationism versus evolution when we do Genesis 1 and 2. Talk about it a little bit, what the text says, different things like that. We'll also talk about the existence of God in Genesis. But anyway, main thing I want to talk about here is the Trinity in Genesis. The angel of Yahweh is constantly proved to be Yahweh. We're going to see that in a text. I already have done videos on this where the angel of Yahweh is Yahweh. See this discussion I have on YouTube. It's a bit heated. It's really heated, but we go through some of my main arguments for the angel of Yahweh being Yahweh. Unfortunately, we didn't touch the Holy Spirit, but it is what it is. You'll see some of my main arguments for the angel of Yahweh being Yahweh, and then I'll expand upon it in the series, and yeah, it'll be great. The Spirit is briefly mentioned. I'm not sure how much. The only one I know off the top of my head is Genesis 1-2. So we'll look at the Spirit also, but mainly we have two persons. Mainly. Not that there's not three, there are three, but in Genesis, mainly what we get revealed are two. So that's the end of the introduction. Hope this helps to sort of springboard the series, give you a little bit of background information. I want you guys to try to keep this stuff in the back of your mind as we go through. And yeah, with that being said, God bless you all and goodbye.